वो इतने से रह गई साइड में वही कैमरा
Hello, can you all see me and hear me? I'm Dr. Urmila Jham. Can you write, someone can write on the chat that you can hear me and see me? We are going to start a class on pediatric emergencies. Chat क्यों नहीं दिख रहा इसमें? कुछ नहीं है chat में अभी. Can you all reply? Somebody can reply me that you can hear me and see me? Chat, reply on the chat. Say yes before I start.
Yes, ma'am. We can see you.
Yes, ma'am. They are now writing. No? Okay, then I'm going to switch off the video and I'm going to start the class. All right, we are going to talk about pediatric emergencies today. In this, we are going to talk about the emergency conditions which you frequently see in children, and our aim will be to discuss their immediate management, not the long-term management, because so many diseases can present in the emergency and there will be too many chapters as such for dealing with each disease, and there will be separate classes on that. So we are going to talk about the immediate management of the patients. So if you look at the conditions which can present to you in the emergencies are respiratory conditions, which is acute respiratory failure or arrest, severe respiratory distress. These are the two types of emergencies. So either a failure or a distress. Just before I start, I can tell you once again, I told the previous group also that a book on the pediatric tutorials is available with the bookshop at MAMC, and the same content which we are teaching will be there in the tutorial book also. So in case you are not able to write down or you are not able to have any problem in understanding, there is a book which writes the same content which we are teaching here, and you can contact the bookshop owner and you can take the book from there. So now going to the CVS emergencies, we can have shock, congestive heart failures, arrhythmias, cardiac arrest, and malignant hypertension. In central nervous system, we can have seizures presenting as status epilepticus, which is a prolonged seizure, or as coma, raised intracranial pressure, head injury, and intracranial bleed. In hematological conditions, we can have severe anemia, acute bleeding from GIT or in the CNS, and DIC. System-wise emergencies, again going to other systems, is gastrointestinal tract, where we can have diarrhea with severe dehydration or other complications like shock or renal failure. We can have fulminant hepatic failure, acute abdomen, GI bleed. They can present as GI emergencies. Similarly, we have oncological emergencies which can present as tumor lysis syndrome, febrile neutropenia, superior vena cava syndrome, severe stridor, or spinal cord compression. In the renal emergencies, we have acute renal failure, and some miscellaneous conditions like temperature disorders of hyperthermia, hypothermia, hypoglycemia, or electrolyte disturbances, and poisonings. Now we have to, whenever we see a sick child, we have to evaluate and resuscitate the patient. So initial impression is audio visual. That means you have not even touched the patient. The patient is just arriving in your emergency, and you have one look at the patient and you just see how the patient looks like. What is the consciousness, breathing, and color? Is the child conscious or unconscious? Is he breathing or not breathing, or is he breathing very fast? What is his color? Is it normal? Is it too pink, or it is blue, or it is mottled, or it is pale? So this will tell you an idea of how sick the child is. A child who is absolutely unconscious or not breathing is an absolute emergency and calls for an emergency team and CPR to be done. Now, after you have seen by the initial assessment that the patient is not requiring anything urgently, then you just start looking at the more detailed examination where you are using your hands on also. The primary assessment of this condition will be ABCDE. This is called primary assessment. That means airway, breathing, circulation, disability, and exposure. Airway, you see whether it is clear or it is maintainable by simple measures, like if you make a head tilt and chin lift, the tongue falling will be taken care of and the airway will be cleared. Or if there are secretions, you can do some suctioning and clear the airway. However, in case of sometimes you put a Goodell's airway also, which you will come and see in the pediatrics and even in the adults, which helps to keep the tongue away from the falling against the mouth, and it allows the breathing to occur. But if these measures are not enough, then the airway is not maintainable by simple measures, and we need to do advanced interventions like intubation. Then breathing. In the breathing, we check 5 things. We look at the respiratory rate. We all know that a respiratory rate of more than 60 in a child who is less than 2 months old is tachypnea. A rate of more than 50 in a child up to infancy is called tachypnea. And after infancy, a respiratory rate of more than 40 is called tachypnea. Also, anytime a respiratory rate of less than 10 is bradypnea. We also look at the effort, that means whether there are LNSI working, whether there are intercostal muscle retractions occurring. So increased effort of breathing is there, or normal effort of breathing is there, or decreased effort of breathing is there when we have a shallow respiration. Then we have a tidal volume. TV is for tidal volume. That means we look at the quantity of chest rise, whether good chest rise is there or it's a very, very shallow respiration. So that will be assessment. And then we see for any extra sounds like stridor, wheezing, any other sounds which are being produced with the respiratory cycle. And then pulse oximeter can tell us what is the saturation. Nowadays, you are all very familiar with the pulse oximeters. Even the public is aware during the COVID period. And we all know that a saturation at least should be more than 94% on the room air. Then we see circulation. And if you look at the skin, what is the color? Is it a cold skin, or it is a normal skin, or a too warm a skin, a very mottled skin? Heart rate, whether there is a normal heart rate or tachycardia. Just remember that a tachycardia can be sinus tachycardia, which can occur in fever, pain, and various conditions. However, if the rate is more than 200 in an infant and more than 180 after infancy, sorry, more than 220 in the infant and after infancy more than 180, this is suggestive of an arrhythmia, which may be a supraventricular tachycardia. Look at the rhythm, whether the rhythm of the heart is normal or abnormal. Capillary filling time or a capillary refill time. If you just press on the thumb and if you find that there is a blanching of the color, which after leaving the compression, if it comes back within 3 seconds, this is normal capillary filling time. If it takes long, it is a prolonged capillary filling time. So capillary filling time, how do you count 3 seconds? Is 1001, 1002, 1003. You don't look at the watch, you just count in your heart these 3 figures, and that makes it 3 seconds. Similarly, you look at the pulses volume, whether it's good or it's a poorly palpable pulses or absent pulses. Then you look at the blood pressure, whether it is normal or not. It is not like adults where the blood pressure has a single value of being, let's say, 120 by 80 being normal. In children, we have children ranging from a newborn to the 12-year of age, and therefore we have different blood pressures which are normal for different age groups. So what I want to tell is that a systolic blood pressure of less than 70 plus age into 2 is a low blood pressure and is equal to shock. So if a 4-year-old child is there, then 70 plus age into 2 is 78. So a blood pressure of less than 78 in a 4-year child, systolic blood pressure, will be a low blood pressure. Then we have D, which is disability. So after we have checked ABC, and if there is any problem with the ABC, we should first correct that. If airway is not clear, we must take care of the airway. If breathing is showing some problem, we must try to give oxygen, we try to give ventilation, whatever is required for the patient. For circulation, if there's a shock, we can give a bolus or something. So after we have stabilized the ABC, then we start looking at the D. We don't look at D till ABC have been normalized by your intervention. D is a disability, and this is not an orthopedic disability, it is a disability of the brain. So you look at the sensorium, whether it is out of A, V, P, U. A is alert, V is response to verbal command, P is response to pain, and U is unresponsive. GCS is a Glasgow Coma scale which has got a maximum score of 15. 15 by 15 is normal sensorium. If there is a less sensorium, then the score will be less. So we can actually assess the sensorium from time to time. If the pupils are dilated and not reacting, this suggests a hypoxic or some kind of a brain damage. Or also if there are unequal pupils, something, so this is suggestive of a disability. Muscle tone, if it is very limp or very rigid, this suggests that there is some neurological disability. And if there are seizures, that also suggests that the brain has suffered from hypoxia during that cardiac or pulmonary or cardiopulmonary event. And these are the 4 things which tell you that there has been a disability. Exposure, of course, you expose the patient, look for any petechiae, look for any tenderness, look for any abnormal temperature, signs of child abuse and trauma. So that is that you must see the patient fully from top to bottom. Next is that we'll first discuss about the respiratory emergencies, and respiratory emergencies will be, look at the left side of the table, respiratory distress or respiratory failure. If there's a respiratory problem, that can also lead to cardiac problem, and cardiac problem can lead to respiratory problem. Ultimately, both together lead to a cardiopulmonary arrest. So respiratory distress and respiratory failure are 2 respiratory problems. During distress, you find a fast breathing, tachypnea, tachycardia, increased effort. That means the alienizai are working, intercostal recessions are there, subcostal recessions are there. And there may be some abnormal sounds, as I have already said, stridor, wheezing, anything may be there. And then in addition, there may be some changes in the mental status also. In the respiratory failure, there is a marked tachypnea or tachycardia. That means when there is severe respiratory distress, it is also early respiratory failure. In the later stages, of course, the rate becomes slow. There is a bradypnea, there is apnea, and there may be respiratory arrest. Increased or decreased efforts may be there, or no efforts may be there finally in a case of respiratory failure. And then the patient will develop cyanosis, they may develop stupor or coma. And if you do the blood gases, the oxygen will be less than 60 and PCO2 will be more than 60 or 50. This is something wrong written in this line, but just read it as PO2 of less than 60 and PCO2 of more than 50 is the ABG sign of respiratory failure. Shock is a condition when there is poor perfusion, so that there is inadequate oxygen and nutrients into the tissues. The goal is to prevent an end organ injury and halt the progression to cardiopulmonary failure and cardiac arrest. The shock may be compensated or hypotensive. In a compensated shock, there are all signs of shock, but the BP is normal. That means by various kinds of compensatory mechanisms, body is trying to maintain the blood pressure. Now, what are the other signs of shock other than the blood pressure which are there in the compensated shock? Are tachycardia, pale skin, prolonged capillary filling time, poor pulse, and oliguria. Just imagine why there's a tachycardia, because heart is trying to work hard to somehow maintain the blood pressure. The skin is pale because capillaries are constricted to maintain the blood pressure. Capillary filling time similarly is more than 3 seconds because capillaries are constricted. The pulse volume is poor because all the vessels are constricted to maintain the blood pressure. Oliguria because kidney is not getting enough blood, so it's forming less urine. So that's all this planktonic circulation is getting constricted, and so that the blood flow to the vital organs like brain and heart may be maintained. But subsequently, in a stage when the compensation is not possible, there is a hypotensive shock, and there the systolic blood pressure becomes less than 70 plus H into 2. This is the blood pressure less than 5th centile. And this is suggestive of hypotensive shock, which is a very serious condition with a high mortality, with high chances of cardiorespiratory arrest in case eventually active action is not taken. Now, the shock is caused in 4 types of conditions. As it is written below, the causes are hypovolemic shock, where there is a loss of blood or water from the body. Supposing there is a dehydration in diarrhea, supposing the burns, there is a loss of plasma, or there is a hemorrhage of some kind, that will lead to hypovolemic shock. And there you need to replace the fluid and the blood as the case may be. In distributive shock, now the problem is that there is a capillary vasodilatation. So whatever is there in the capillaries is now not enough for them, and the BP will fall. So there is a maldistribution of the blood and the capillaries. So this is a distributive shock. The commonest example of this is a septic shock. However, anaphylactic shock and spinal shock also are the examples of distributive shocks. In cardiogenic shock, it may be either the abnormal rhythm or a congestive heart failure where the myocardium is poor, or severe hypertension may be there. These can lead to poor cardiac output, and that will cause cardiogenic shock. In the obstructive shock, there is a problem in the filling of the heart or ejection of the blood from the heart. So if you have a large pericardial effusion or cardiac tamponade, that will prevent the heart from getting the blood that comes from the body, and similarly then the cardiac output also will be low. The treatment of shock will be, of course, when you find a patient is having poor pulses, poor capillary filling time, first thing is to start the oxygen, so that whatever blood is going into the body, it should be fully oxygenated. Then you give a fluid bolus of 20 ml per kg saline. That means if there's a 10 kg child, we will give 200 ml of saline at a time. It should be given rapidly in most of the children. Nowadays, what they say is that if it is a compensated shock, then you can give this bolus over about half an hour. But if the patient is in hypotensive shock, then you don't have time, and you should just push the bolus with the syringes. So just take some in the syringe, push, then take more in the syringe and push, and 200 ml should be pushed in 5 to 10 minutes. So in hypotensive shock, we should be more fast. Now, in case there has been an improvement after one bolus, you may not give second bolus. If the improvement is partial, you can give second bolus. Again, if the improvement is partial, you can give the third bolus also, one after the other. After 3 boluses, you should not give any fluid boluses. You should now go on to inotropes, because the cause may be not just hypovolemia, it may be something else also, and the blood vessels need to be constricted with the inotropes. In case of hemorrhagic shock, after giving 3 boluses, you can give 1 blood transfusion as well. But the first one should not be a blood transfusion. In a child with hemorrhagic shock, you don't give blood straight away. First, you are giving fluids only. And if it doesn't settle with 3 fluid boluses, then you will give blood transfusion. Antibiotics in the septic shock are required to be given in the first 1 hour. That's called the golden hour. And the action should start immediately, because the cause of shock has to be taken care of. Then also you should correct the metabolic disturbances. Now, just before I go further, I think we are talking here mainly when we are continuing further, it is a case of septic shock. In hypovolemic shock, usually by giving the fluid boluses and the blood, whatever the case may be, you don't need to go beyond that and it will get settled. In septic shock or in the distributive shock, this is the protocol that I am telling. So along with the antibiotics, you must correct the metabolic disturbances of any hyponatremia, hypoglycemia, any calcium abnormalities by giving calcium gluconate, any magnesium abnormalities, etc. And also you should do the source control. That means supposing there is a case of empyema with shock, you must drain the pus from the chest also. Inotropes which we give are dopamine, adrenaline, and inodilators. Nowadays, adrenaline is preferred as a first inotrope, followed by any other that you may choose to use. Steroids are not normally given in case of distributive and septic shock unless the patient has been steroid dependent. That means he has been on prolonged steroids before he developed shock, like nephrotic patients, etc.
इंजन पे डालना था, 7 लोगों की लग गई वो चीज। संगीता यादव मैम का रूम बंद है और मुक्ता मैम और राजेश्वरी मैम ने मना कर दिया।
Just 1 second, give me a break.
मुक्ता मैम और राजेश्वरी मैम ने मना कर दिया नहीं लगवानी, और संगीता यादव मैम को
उनसे फोन पे पूछने लगवानी भी है कि तकलीफ कम तो ना है।
हाँ, बाकी हो गया काम,
बाकी हो गया 100 पर के हिसाब से
7 लोगों ने
700 वापस कर देगा ना बाकी डॉक्टर यादव का पूछ लो। Yes, we'll continue. You should maintain a hemoglobin of more than 10 because hemoglobin carries the oxygen most of the times to the tissues. Very little oxygen is there dissolved in the plasma. So we should maintain a good hemoglobin in cases of shock. And then the subsequent cases to reduce the metabolic oxygen demand, we can use ventilation also. Then the cardiac arrest is the next condition, which is an emergency. Pulseless arrest, or it can be either with the abnormal rhythm, which is shockable rhythm like ventricular tachycardia or ventricular failure, ventricular fibrillation, sorry, or it may not be shockable as a asystole like condition where you have a straight line. So when there's a asystole, you just need to give CPR and epinephrine. And in the ET tube, also you can give epinephrine. And you can repeat epinephrine every 3 to 5 minutes along with the CPR in case of a cardiac arrest. And in case of shockable rhythm, the difference is that in addition to CPR, you also need to give a shock, that is 2 joules per kg in a patient. So that was the only difference that I wanted to highlight. Other cardiac emergencies are arrhythmias. You may have a bradyarrhythmias or tachyarrhythmias. Bradyarrhythmias are when the heart rate is less than 60 with poor perfusion. That's an important condition. Some of the athletes will have a heart rate of 55 or 52, but they have got very strong hearts. That is not bradycardia, because bradycardia is if there is in addition poor pulses also. So in normal person who is not an athlete, if the heart rate is less than 60 and the perfusion is poor, that is the bradyarrhythmia. And the causes of bradycardia or bradyarrhythmia would be sometimes deep sleep, rest, hypothermia, poison, electrolyte disturbance, thyroid disorders, hypoglycemia or apnea. So anyway, just remember that the most common cause of a sinus bradycardia is hypoxia. So most of the time such patients would require oxygen. Of course, if that is not the cause and you are still trying to find the cause, and if it is a symptomatic bradycardia with the heart rate with poor perfusion, the drugs which can be used are epinephrine or atropine. Also, there are various heart blocks of first, second and third degree heart blocks which can cause bradycardia with an irregular heartbeat. So you will need a pacemaker for a third degree heart block. Now basically what I am trying to do is an introduction to the emergencies and not in detail the management of each and every emergency, so that you should be able to recognize and give the first aid to the patient. Similarly, tachyarrhythmias are two types, the ventricular type or supraventricular type. The SVT or supraventricular tachycardia originates above the ventricle in the atria or in some kind of a node. Here the QRS complexes are narrow. In ventricular tachycardia, which originates from the ventricle, the QRS complexes are wide. So as I had already told you in the definition of tachycardia, that if the heart rate is more than 220 in the infants and more than 180 after the infancy, this is suggestive of a tachyarrhythmia and not a sinus tachycardia. That means it is likely to be a supraventricular tachycardia. Here also there will be no P waves because P waves originate from the atria, and this tachycardia is originating below the atria into some kind of a node. Adenosine can be given IV or a DC shock can be given in case of pulseless supraventricular tachycardia. VT or the ventricular tachycardia is a wide complex tachycardia. The treatment of that will be DC shock, amiodarone and lignocaine as the drugs. Now we go to congestive heart failure, which is caused by various conditions like rheumatic heart disease, congenital heart disease, arrhythmias, myocarditis, etc. Or there will be respiratory distress, tachycardia, cardiomegaly, murmurs and poor pulses. So something will be pointing towards the heart disease. Whether it's a congenital heart, there will be murmurs. If it's a myocarditis, there will be no murmur, but there will be tachycardia. Pulses will be poor if there's a cardiogenic shock. So this will suggest that the congestive heart failure is there. And the treatment of congestive heart failure will be by giving oxygen by giving diuretics like furosemide, digoxin. Nowadays, we prefer in congenital heart disease at least enalapril before digoxin. So you give oxygen diuretic and enalapril. Only if in few cases digoxin is required, you can give, otherwise it doesn't have much role nowadays. And of course, you will treat the cause of the congestive heart failure, whatever it is. In malignant hypertension, it is the condition where the BP is very high, and along with that, there is some kind of an organ involvement. Something like, supposing you have hypertensive encephalopathy, you may have a hypertensive renal failure, you may have changes in the eye, or a hypertensive congestive heart failure. This is called malignant hypertension. So this is an emergency and needs to be treated. So then you may use either a nitroprusside drip or labetalol infusion, commonly used, or sublingual nifedipine, which is nowadays not used because it immediately causes the blood pressure to crash, so that you don't want a sudden fall in the BP. So the second drug, sublingual nifedipine, is out of the pharmacopoeia now for the treatment of malignant hypertension. The most commonly used is labetalol infusion. Actually, you can adjust the infusion rate in such a manner that whatever degree of fall you want, supposing the BP is 160 and you want to bring it to 90 systolic, so you want to have a fall of 70 in this. So whatever degree of fall you want to have 1/3 of it in the first 12 hours and the rest of it in the next 12 to 24 hours. So it should fall slowly. And if there's a rapid fall with the sublingual nifedipine, this can create damage to the brain, and therefore now it is not recommended. Another drug which can of course use is a nitroprusside drip, 3 to 10 microgram per kg per minute, and that can be given as a initial starting dose and then continue with the 0.5 microgram per kg per minute as the drip. And you can adjust the rates again once you have taken care of the hypertensive emergency and the BP has been brought down to some reasonable level. Then you can continue the patient with the antihypertensive drugs later, and you can diagnose and investigate for the cause of hypertension. Now we go to the CNS emergencies. This is seizures. Even though you have a separate class on status epilepticus, so I'm not going to go into the details of the seizures, except that you should diagnose that if there are continuous or multiple seizures, any child who is coming with the seizures in the hospital and has been starting seizure at home means he has seizured long enough to be in the status. The drugs which can be used for initial use are benzodiazepines, either diazepam, midazolam, or lorazepam, and subsequently you can use phenytoin, barbitone, phenobarbital, valproate, or midazolam infusion, or thiopentone coma. Not going into details of it deliberately because this is going to be taken up separately in status epilepticus. Now, coma in children is when you have a low AVPU scale. Supposing you have a patient not alert, either he is responding to verbal commands or painful stimulus, or is unresponsive, or he has a low GCS, then that means the patient is having altered sensorium and not responsive to most of your things will be called coma, unresponsive, or a very low GCS. A GCS of less than 8, as I said, the maximum GCS is 15, and a GCS of less than 8 causes airway problem, and the patient is not able to maintain the airway, and therefore they will need intubation. Also, in a patient of coma, of course, if GCS is more than 8, then intubation is not required. You just manage the cause of coma, whatever is the cause. The coma can be caused by various head injuries. It can be caused by metabolic problems like diabetic ketoacidosis, renal encephalopathy, hypertensive encephalopathy, hypoglycemias, hypernatremias, etc. So whatever is the cause, that has to be taken care of in the coma. So you take care of the bowel, bladder, and the bed sores in the comatose patient. You treat the cause. Whatever it is, the cause has to be treated. Only then coma will be improved. And take care of the airway if the GCS is less than 8. I have already said. Also, with coma, there may be association of a raised intracranial pressure. I'm going to talk next about the raised intracranial pressure. And in patients, those who have it, that should also be taken care of. The raised ICP is the next emergency which can present to you with alteration of sensorium and with some other features. The normal CSF pressure is 10 millimeters, and if there's more than that, it is going to create symptoms of raised intracranial pressure, which will present to you as a bradycardia, hypertension, worsening of the Glasgow coma scale, changes in the pupillary reactions, and false localizing signs. The treatment of this raised ICT will be that you increase the head end up to 30° up. Hyperventilation can occur only transiently in the impending herniation. That means you just take a ambu bag or something and just keep on hyperventilating that patient. That will wash out the carbon dioxide, and carbon dioxide, when it is washed out, will cause constriction of the brain capillaries, which will then occupy less space in the cranial vault and give more space for the swollen brain to remain there, so the pressure will fall down. Hypertonic saline or mannitol can be given as the osmotic agents. Nowadays, hypertonic saline is more preferred because unlike mannitol, it does not cause any shock-like condition. Hypertonic saline, in fact, increases the blood pressure and also increases the sodium level. It is given as 6 ml per kg over 30 minutes, and it can be followed by a drip of 0.5 to 1 ml per kg per hour and maintain the sodium 145 at least. Previously, they used to say 150. Nowadays, they say 145. Now we go to the head injury or polytrauma case. Head injury is only a part of the trauma. Trauma can occur in the whole body. And then you have, again, look at the ABC. Supposing the patient has had an injury, either it may be a fall from the roof or it may be a road traffic accident. Head injury will be a part of the trauma. There could be trauma to the other organs also. So if there is a alteration of sensorium, ENT bleed or seizures, you do suspect a head injury. Whenever you suspect a head injury, you will look for ABC and stabilize them. Look for the spine and the other injuries. Now the other injuries, I will just talk after a while. In the brain, you will take care of the intracranial bleed as intracranial pressure and pain. So all the patients who present with signs of raised ICT with head injury, I have just now told you that you can give hyperventilation, you can give 3% saline and mannitol if required. And of course, in the cases where there is a big hematoma, it will need a surgical drainage. And then other injuries can be, let's say, to the thorax. Supposing there has been unequal chest rise, there might be pneumothorax on one side. Sometimes there may be flail chest when there are multiple rib injuries, or there may be 1 or 2 ribs may be involved in the injury and there will be a lot of pain. So you have to see and accordingly treat. If there is a pneumothorax, you need to drain that. Similarly, the surgery injury can occur to the heart and there may be a hemorrhagic pericardial effusion also, which will need to be drained if there is a cardiac tamponade. Also, abdomen can suffer from various injuries. There can be injuries to liver, pancreas, bowel, etc. Most of these injuries can be managed conservatively. There is something called as a FAST, that is a focused ultrasound for abdominal trauma. So in that case, you just have a look at the abdomen with the ultrasound. In case there is any fluid in the abdomen that is suggestive of a possible bleed, and that calls for doing a CT scan and confirming where is the injury, and then you have to take a situation whether it requires a surgical management or it can be done conservatively. Usually bowel perforations will require surgery, the liver damage will be managed conservatively, pancreas and spleen might also be managed conservatively. So it depends how you have to treat that. And plus you have to also have an assessment of all the skeleton, the head and limbs and the hands and the arms. There may be a broken femur, there may be some fractures which may need surgical or orthopedic management. And also if there's a lot of bleed, you may take care of the hemorrhagic shock. So this is about the trauma. Then in the hematological emergencies, if there's a severe anemia with a very low hemoglobin, it will cause congestive heart failure, and that will need for a blood transfusion. Otherwise, if the hemoglobin is more than 4, you can diagnose and treat the cause of anemia, but do not need a blood transfusion. Now there can be GI bleeds. It's a common condition in children. It can occur with portal hypertension, particularly extrahepatic portal hypertension, which is common in children. There may be bleed from the esophageal varices. They will vomit and there will be hemoptysis. When such a patient comes with the blood vomiting, You need to look at the ABC. You see if the airway is clear, if the breathing is okay, if the circulation is there. Do they need any fluid resuscitation? Do they need any blood transfusion? So you give bolus, blood, whatever is required, and then put an ice tube and do the GI aspiration so that you can continue to assess the amount of blood which is coming out subsequently. And then you can give octreotide infusion, which is somatostatin, and this is good to control the varicose bleed. Sometimes there is a need for an emergency sclerotherapy or banding of the varices also, and sometimes the surgical management would be also required. So I'm just giving you an overview of how to manage it in the emergency. Subsequent management will be a full chapter by itself. Other bleeds we are not discussing. Tumor lysis syndrome I will just discuss in brief regarding the oncological emergencies. If there's a very high tumor load, it's a big tumor or a leukemia with a very high total leukocyte count, more than 50,000 TLC. Whenever you will give chemotherapy, there will be a sudden killing of the cancer cells, and then whatever is the content of the cells will be released into the blood. So there will be hyperkalemia, hyperuricemia, hyperphosphatemia, and that hyperphosphatemia will lead to hypocalcemia. So if you find any such condition, you may be prepared for dealing with the tumor lysis syndrome and also diagnosing it if such a situation arises. So let's say you are giving a chemotherapy to a leukemia with a 1 lakh TLC count. You should know that you will probably get it, so you can get these things tested and so that you are ready for a treatment. So the treatment will be for hyperuricemia, we give allopurinol. We also give 2 to 4 times the maintenance IV fluid. Supposing the patient needs 100 ml per kg of IV fluid maintenance, such a patient should get 200 ml per kg of IV maintenance IV fluid. But along with that, you should give a diuretic also, so that this is passed out in the urine, doesn't cause a congestive heart failure. And along with that, the contents of hyperkalemia, hyperuricemia also will be washed out. Also, you can give soda bicarb to maintain the urine pH of 7 to 7.5. So alkaline diuretic will be used. So urine will be alkalinized as well as diuresis will be done along with the extra fluid to wash out all these substances. If it is very bad and cannot be managed with just the maintenance fluids, then dialysis may be required. If hypocalcemia is there, you will give calcium. For hyperkalemia, you will treat the hyperkalemia as such also. So the management of electrolyte disorders will be a separate class. I am not going to details of how you treat hyperkalemia and how you treat hypocalcemia here. Febrile neutropenia, we can leave it. Metabolic emergencies are the next. Before I go to the metabolic emergencies, actually my new PPT which I had prepared has been left at home, and here I'm putting it on another laptop. So the two topics which I had added are not here. One is the heat stroke, that is the temperature abnormalities, and the other one is the drowning. So basically in a heat stroke, actually I can tell you in brief that what will happen is that if the very hot environment, the heat stroke can occur, let's say athletes. Just a second. I think there's a connection problem. Okay, now restart it. In hyperthermia, sorry. Hyperthermia or heat stroke can occur in athletes who are playing in the hot sun, or in the workers, laborers who are working in the hot weather, or in children if by mistake they are left and locked in the car which is parked in the sun. So various conditions can cause heat stroke or heat exhaustion. What will happen is that the patient will have a very high temperature, hyperthermia, looks dehydrated, and if it is there for a long period, it can lead to liver failure, etc. So if you find that such a setting is there and the patient is having very high fever, 105 degree, 106 degrees of fever, and looks dehydrated, then you need to cool the patient immediately. Here your paracetamol is not going to work. Here what you need to do is to cool the patient. So you may need to blow cool mist, or you can put them in the bathtub, cold water, or you can give a sponging with the cold water, or ice water, gastric saline lavage also can be done. So somehow you have to cool down the patient. Otherwise there will be liver failure and it can lead to death also. and various organ failures. So this was about the heat stroke, and then about the drowning. Drowning can be there in various situations. Of course, you can have drowning in the river and the sea and the ponds, etc. But sometimes the bathtub drowning in the home also can occur. Recently, there was a news in the TV that one child got drowned in the bathtub at home because the two siblings were playing. One was in the bathtub and the water level was not so high in that, but the tap was on by the older sibling and the water level kept on rising till the younger one got actually drowned in the water and died in the bathtub itself. So at home, one has to be very careful not to fill water in the bathtub or not to allow the entry of the children unobserved into the bathroom where the water is lying. Of course, you can definitely have the drownings in various open lakes and ponds and other things due to various reasons. To prevent that, of course, one should have a fencing around the ponds. One should be having coaches there to rescue if required. So whenever there is a drowning, what happens is that initially there is a kind of a laryngospasm, and in that the person almost tries to not swallow anything, becomes hypoxic, and finally the drive to breathe becomes very urgent, and then when they swallow in, the whole water gets into the lungs and it causes, it's like absolutely flooding the lungs immediately and no supply of oxygen to the body, and it can lead to a very rapid deterioration and cardiac arrest. So if the drowned victim is not rescued very rapidly, the chances of survival become very less. So if you initially the patient is taken out very fast, the moment you see drowning and the person is taken out, then the person may have swallowed a lot of water into the stomach and they may be vomiting a lot of water, and or a quick CPR may be done if there is an indication of possible arrhythmia or cardiac arrest. And however, if the patient is late and has already suffered a hypoxic damage to the brain and is brought, then of course all resuscitative measures have to be done at the hospital or the center where they arrive, and you need to take care of various organ failures, and then all the supportive management, and of course then the outcome is not very good. So that was about the drowning and the heat stroke. And then fluid electrolyte disturbance as an emergency, of course, will be taken as in a separate class. Regarding the metabolic disturbances, we have hypoglycemia and hyperglycemia. Again, sodium and other disturbances I'm not discussing here. Electrolyte will be separate class. In hypoglycemia, if in a newborn, in first day, a blood sugar of less than 25. After second, third day, a blood sugar of less than 40. Sorry, first day less than 25, second, third day less than 45, and subsequently in children, a blood sugar of less than 55 is considered as hypoglycemia. Hypoglycemia can cause sweating, cold extremities, loss of sensorium, and even seizures in the infants. And in the newborns, if it occurs, it can lead to a permanent brain damage also. So whenever you detect hypoglycemia, of course, who gets it are the preterm infants, neonates, or the malnourished children, or those who have had various kinds of inborn errors of metabolism, or with the liver failure, etc. So whenever you have a hypoglycemia, you need to give 10% dextrose, 2 to 5 ml per kg stat, and subsequently you may need to give a drip to maintain the blood sugar levels. So you should frequently check it for some time till the blood sugars are stabilized. Hyperglycemia, of course, you all know that hyperglycemia commonly occurs in diabetes and diabetic ketoacidosis, but sometimes a transient hyperglycemia can occur in critically ill patients. That means those who are in the ICUs, etc., with various other kinds of illnesses. The blood glucose can get more than 180 to 200, and this can worsen the overall outcome. So if your blood sugars are getting more than 200 and it is causing the diuresis, it is causing dehydration, you may need to give a small insulin infusion, very small rates of insulin infusion to control these blood sugars transiently. They will not become diabetics later, but this is only transient hyperglycemia. To improve the outcomes, you need to tackle that also, and to maintain a blood sugar ideally less than 200 at least. So this was about the metabolic disturbances. And That's it. Let me look at your chat if I have anything. So somebody has asked me what is meant by D3 and D5 in febrile neutropenia. Of course, I had skipped that slide, but D3 and D5 is day 3 and day 5. So you add some antibiotics by day 3, you add some antibiotics by day 5. So just left it actually. So I think it's time for the next class. So I will end the session here. एक मिनट डॉक्टर पल्लवी को बुलाओ जरा.